Welcome to Someone Talks, the official podcast of the National D-Day Memorial, where leading experts spill all the secrets of the Second World War. With your host, Dr. John C. McManus.
Greetings. Welcome to Someone Talked. I'm your host, Dr. John C. McManus from Missouri S&T. Alongside, as always, are my good, dear friends and partners in crime from the National D-Day Memorial Foundation, April Cheek Messier and John Long. Greetings, folks.
Hello. Ready to talk resistance.
That's right. In the movie Gone with the Wind, the Carpetbaggers are bad guys, but the Carpetbaggers in this episode are the heroes.
Different Carpetbagger. That's right.
Very different. Yes, exactly. So to discuss that, of course, we have Bruce Henderson, who's the author of Midnight Flyboys, the American bomber crews and Allied secret agents who aided the French resistance in World War II. So the book is so fascinating because it's kind of a dual look to the two elements of these various clandestine missions. The bomber crewmen of the B-24s who flew these so-called carpetbagger missions, that was the code name, and then the resistance operators who were multinational, of course, who are there on the ground in France. Bruce, in terms of his background, just by way of introduction, he's a veteran of the United States Navy, and we very much thank him for his service. And he was an investigative journalist for many years who decided that he wanted like the deeper dive of history, getting into doing history. And I could certainly relate to that as we've discussed, but he's the author of many books, including multiple New York Times #1 bestsellers, because Bruce understands very well, how to do real research, in-depth historical research, but tell a story, captivated by the human story. And he's done a number of course, very successful books, which were, many of which are just that I've just been fascinated and loved. Most notably his book on the Los Baños raid, and then another one called Sons and Soldiers, another one called Bridge to the Sun. It goes on and on and on, but we're really honored to have him here today to talk about his latest offering, Midnight Flyboys. So in the first episode we had with you, Bruce, we focused primarily on the B-24 crew and the Carpetbagger guys. We thought we'd flip the switch a little bit, at least to start in this one, and talk about the people who are on the other side of these supply drops. So the purpose of the Carpetbagger raids, just in case you've never heard of it, was to support resistance movements in Western Europe, especially France, but also Netherlands, Belgium, so on and so forth. So how did these resistance groups work? How do they communicate with the Carpetbaggers? How did all this whole world operate?
Yeah, that's a good question. By the way, about 90% of these Carpetbagger flights were going into Nazi-occupied France, and then the rest, notably Belgium. There were some resistance networks up there. But I, for the purposes of this story, decided I would basically wanted to tell the story of the reason they were put together and to start with was to build up the resistance groups in anticipation of D-Day. The partisans were they weren't a one-size-fit-all kind of resistance, and there some very many tomes have been written about their. Some of them were pro-communist, some of them were anti-communist, some of them loved de Gaulle, some of them hated de Gaulle, and I was basically wanting to stay away from all of that and kind of internal stuff. But that's not to say that they didn't have their issues, and that was part of the challenge, if you will, of the agents that were parachuting in there, was to bring these groups, these individuals with these various ideas about what France should look like after the war, together now to get rid of the Germans and to liberate the country and to help the Allies win the war. So to do that, they would need radios first and foremost to be able to contact London and give their shopping list of needs, what they needed to carry out their acts of sabotage that they were going to be assigned to do both before and on and after D-Day. They needed some organizational abilities. They were taught how to also to operate certain kinds of weapons that were new to them, explosives, certainly, setting bombs to go off to take out a bridge. That wasn't something the average French farmer knew how to do. So they really had to be trained by munitions experts and agents who knew how to do that. That became the mission, and certainly some areas of France had better, shall we say, and more organized resistance efforts than some other places. But there were overall in France about 80 separate resistance networks. Some of them would be a few hundred people, and some of them would be several thousand. So it varied depending on where you were in France.
Well, introduce us to two very important characters to your story, Joe and Josephine. Who were they, and what did it take for a person to be a Joe or a Josephine?
Yeah, those names came as a result of the fact that none of the guys on the bomber crews knew the names, of course, of the real agents that they were dropping, for obvious reasons. If they went down and were interrogated, they didn't want to have that kind of information, so they just became known as this, I guess, nom de plume, right? If it's a guy, it's Joe, and if it's a woman agent, it's a Josephine. And so these were mostly going to be British trained, again, because the British intelligence service was ahead of the Americans because they'd been doing it longer. The British started organizing resistance networks in France as early as 1940, right after the Germans invaded France. And of course, that was still a couple of years before we got into the war. So a lot of them are British. Some are also American, who were trained by the OSS, the precursor to the CIA. They had a complete skill set. They had to do it all. They had to be able to operate the radios. They had to be able, of course, to speak fluent French in the case of being dropped in France. And that doesn't mean that they took 4 years of France in college. They really had to speak it as like a native to be able to pass, questioning by French, the militia, French police, who were, just as fervent Nazis as the SS. And they had to be able to do it all. They had to know how to use to do all of the weaponry and make sure that the groups that they were responsible for all had their target lists and knew when they were to strike. They weren't going to strike early. They didn't want them to take a bridge out that the Allies say would need on D-Day to come further inland. They had to be it wasn't just, knocking down every telephone pole, because some of them were going to be used for our own communication. So it had to be very, very detail oriented. And again, the key was the radio. Being in touch with London by virtue of those field radios was key to getting the message out to the resistance forces.
So, Bruce, a quick question to you about some of those agents, the Josephines. Of the 39 women who served as agents in France, I know 13 were killed. And just really the odds with them volunteering and knowing that you had about a 50-50 chance of survival is pretty remarkable that any of them still volunteered, and they did. They were very passionate about it. And one of those that really stuck out to me, of course, was the story of Nancy Wake. And I was so glad that you highlighted her story because oftentimes I feel like hers has been a little overlooked so there's some very popular stories out there of these agents, but I was so glad that you talked about Nancy Wake. So can you tell us a little bit about her and why maybe we haven't heard more of her story before?
Yeah, I'm not sure we haven't heard more of her story before. In fact, my publisher at some point said, "Hey, Bruce, after this, you want to do a book on Nancy Wake?" So, but my gosh, I have a lot in there about Nancy Wake. I found her to be an extraordinary character and wonderful character. She was born in New Zealand and raised in Australia, and as a young woman in the mid-30s, ended up in London working as a news correspondent. And at some point she was sent over to Paris. And again, this was before the war, 35, 36, to be reporting there. By the time say the Germans invade France 5 years later, she's married to a Frenchman. She's fluent in French, living in Marseille, the port city on the very south of France. And she's very much, as a reporter, she had gone into Austria and had seen how the Nazis were treating, Jewish shopkeepers and whatnot, and became very much anti-Nazi, and immediately started working with the resistance forces in 1940 as a courier, running messages back and forth. And for 2 or 3 years was so successful that the Gestapo ended up having a bounty on her, dead or alive. They didn't know her real name, but they called her the White Mouse because she flitted around and they could never really capture her. And at some point, it was decided that she needed to get out of the country because they were closing in on her. And so she was able to get out and actually went over the Pyrenees on one of the escape routes that she'd helped set up for the Allied airmen that were going down to try to get them out of France and into Spain and eventually back to England. So she went out that way. And her husband was going to follow in a couple of weeks. He never did. She was in London, not sure what was happening, whether her husband would ever make it out. And at that point, she was recruited by the British and to go back in and parachute back into France, and certainly had the language skills and already the experience working with resistance forces. And her motivation was she knew she couldn't go down to Marseille and look up her husband. It would be too dangerous for her and her husband. And again, she didn't know where he was by then. And so she was dropped into central France around Paris, and as a courier, went in with a 3-man team, and that was fairly typical. You'd have an organizer, and then you would have often the radio man, radio operator, and then the courier. And but Nancy was doing almost from the beginning way more than just courier work. She was directly doing organizational work as well, and was a fighter. She, in fact, one of the resistance leaders that she fought with said that Nancy was the most feminine woman he ever knew, but when it came time to fight, she fought like 5 men. And so she was highly motivated to, France was, her adopted country. She loved it. She wanted it liberated. She wanted to find her husband. She wanted the war to be over, and she was going to do what she could do to have that happen.
Yeah, she's clearly a remarkable person. I mean, you really develop her in the book. You get to know her really well, and it's also true for Violet Szabo. You cover her quite a bit in the book too, and she's a little bit better known. There's a portrait picture of her, which is often kind of emblematic of the feminine side of the French resistance. So I wonder if you could, tell us who was she and ultimately what made her such a tragic figure.
Yeah, and also from an author point of view, I like the fact that Nancy and Violet knew each other. They met in training, and were grew very close to each other. They were, although they didn't serve once they got into France, they were dropped in different areas. Violet she was born in France. Her father was British and her mom was French. And she went to secondary school in France, and then at some point before the war, the family moved to England. And she ended up meeting and marrying, after a whirlwind romance of about 6 or 8 weeks, a very dashing member of the French Foreign Legion who was in London, was part of de Gaulle's Free French forces that were then sent to North Africa to fight Rommel and the Germans, where he was killed. And so Violet, even though in England she was really doing her part, she was on one of the anti-aircraft crews that actually were crewed by a lot of women, because the men were going off, to fight in North Africa and places like that. And so they were operating these guns, trying to shoot down the German planes that were coming over and bombing London. But she felt she wanted to do more, and she ended up volunteering to go in and to parachute into France as part of the SOE. Her motivation was clear and simple: revenge. She just wanted to get payback in some way or other for the death of her husband. And she made not just one, but ended up 2 parachute missions into France. After the first one, she was taken out on one of the small planes and returned to London, and then given another mission to go back. And she said she was told she didn't have to really do a second mission. The first was quite enough and quite dangerous enough, and she could do other things here. But no, she volunteered for the second mission, and she became. I mean, she's. I guess you have to say she is a tragic figure because of what happened to her. Unlike Nancy Wake, who lived a long life and lived to almost 100, Violet Szabó ended up being captured after a gunfight with German soldiers, and ended up being shipped to Ravensbrück, the camp for women, and was, along with 2 other SOE female agents, was about 3 months before the war, was executed there. Orders were coming out from the Gestapo in Berlin, even as the Third Reich was collapsing, to camps that were holding any of these SOE or OSS agents to execute them all. They were never ever treated like POWs. They were treated as spies and were, in most cases, executed after being tortured. And so she sadly, is remembered for that sacrifice, along with the other women, of course, who were also killed that day, executed that same time.
Bruce, who was Johnny Meade, and what was unique about his story as a carpetbagger, and also what happened to the rest of the Simon crew?
Yeah, I followed the Simon crew. I decided I wanted to, I have a lot of crews in and out, and we talk about different missions, but it was important to me to find a crew that I could focus on too, that again, the reader could get to know the individuals in the crew. Johnny Meade was the bombardier of the Simon crew. The pilot was Murray Simon. That's why it was called the Simon crew. And and interestingly, the bombardiers on the Carpetbagger flights, of course, they didn't have any bombs to drop. But what he would do is sit up in the nose of the plane and look out the bubble canopy, if you will, and try to pick up different landmarks that they had to pass or should be going over to get to their target, looking for a river, a mountain range, whatever. And meanwhile, the navigator was also in the nose of the plane, but his back was turned. It was never looking to the outside because he had his maps, he had a little light, and he was doing that. But then when it's the time to drop the canisters on the over the target, the bombardier would release them just like he would bombs. Anyway, the Simon crew got shot down on a mission, and what was interesting is all 8 of the guys in the crew, including the pilot, and often the pilots did not get out, because the ethos of the World War II bomber pilot was you stay at the controls and allow the crew to get out. I mean, they understood that, they knew that, they accepted that. Certainly the pilot was the last to leave the plane. And they all got out. And what was very interesting is you got 8 guys parachuting out over darkened France, middle of the night, whatever, and they never met each other once they hit the ground. They all had a different journey. They were blown, this way, that way. I found that extraordinary. Some of them did make it out over the Pyrenees. In fact, the pilot, Murray Simon, made it out and got back to England before anybody else. Johnny Meade ended up with a group of resistance fighters, and they were getting ready to put him on one of the escape routes to get him out too. But one of the leader came to him and said, we're a little short-handed here. Johnny, do you think you could stay and help us? And he said, well, Meade said, I'd be happy to, but I don't want to be a deserter. We have to send a radio message to London to make sure if it's okay. So they did. And about a week later, the message came back that you could keep him. And they had his service number. You could keep 7856402. So Johnny Meade became the only member of the Carpetbaggers who was officially assigned to the fight with the French resistance. And he spent the next several months with the resistance forces and ended up earning not just 1, but 2 silver stars for courage in combat and whatnot, and was quite a character.
Well, Bruce, going back to the B-24, I know a lot of our listeners geek out over the hardware of World War II aviation. So just to talk a little bit about the B-24, obviously there had to be some modifications to do this type of work. And why was that particular plane, the B-24, chosen for carpetbagger missions?
Yeah, that's a good question, April. The plane was better. The B-24 was better than the B-17 for the carpetbagger missions because it was faster and it could carry more payload. That said, the squadrons that were flying the B-24s were chosen for this particular mission because they had experience, as I'd mentioned, on the low-level anti-submarine patrols that they had been doing. So it was a kind of a combination. It was the right plane and the right crews to do the carpetbagger mission. But as you say, a lot of modifications. To start with, they took all the armor plates out of the plane to make it lighter. Well, that meant if they were going to get shot at, they weren't going to have that protection. If they're going to get shot at either from the ground or from enemy fighters. They also took out 2 of the gun turrets, and one of them, in fact, the one on the belly of the plane, became the hole that the agents dropped out of, parachuted out of. Henceforth, it was called the Joe hole, and so there were these kinds of modifications for that mission, but they were not the easiest plane to fly. In fact, one pilot described it like flying a garbage truck, and particularly low and slow. Again, not the optimum way to fly that aircraft. And I was constantly amazed that there weren't more accidents, and there actually were, of course, some in which they hit the ground, hit the trees, hit the side of a ridge or something. I mean, that did happen, and not surprisingly, because they were flying so low and slow in the dark. But yeah, it was pretty extraordinary.
Yeah, I mean, the book, I mean, you just have like this intimate knowledge of the B-24 that shines through, almost like someone who had flown it. So it brings to mind for me a question like, how did you learn such intimate details about the aircraft? I mean, it could, to the point where you could really communicate what the B-24 was like.
I'm really glad to hear that, because I've never flown in one.
I haven't either.
I interviewed a lot of people and certainly got a lot of from oral histories and whatnot. The guys who did fly in it. And it's always important to have, and you don't even know, even a handful of people who have done something like that. And then for me to have them to call repeatedly when things come up, how did you keep the coffee hot in the plane on the long flight? I mean, those kind of irritating questions that were so important for an author. I will say that I did crawl through one at an air show, and I'm a bit claustrophobic, and I can tell you I would never have been able to fly at a B-24. I mean, particularly that long and at night. I mean, they are very tight quarters, and then the terrifying thought of trying to parachute out of one as a crewman. Not necessarily, you're not going out that Joe hole. You're coming out, you're trying to find your emergency exit when the plane is maybe on its side and smoking. I mean, how any of them got out is sort of beyond my imagination.
It is. It's kind of mind blowing. I mean, and I guess people were smaller back then, still. I mean, because I've crawled through them too, and you have to crawl. I mean, in a way, the idea of flying in that and at altitude too. The carpetbaggers aren't doing that. They're flying lower. They're not on oxygen for these missions, so it's a little different than the other B-2. But so what? I mean, it's just the whole thing is kind of mind blowing. So. One of the downsides about writing about World War II today, of course, is that almost all the participants are gone. This is particularly, the military guys who did these missions. So do you know, are any carpetbaggers still living? Were you able to talk to any of them? Was there any of that kind of basis?
Yeah, and you're so right, John. And that's really, for me, one of the really sad things, of course, is, I mean, even going back to Sons and Soldiers 3 books ago, I had so many Ritchie boys that I could talk to, became friends with, who would go to their city, just figure on spending 3-4 days with them, breaking bread and running the tape recorder. And that's just in every book since then. There have been fewer and fewer and fewer. There were 3 carpetbaggers alive when I started the book, and one of them just died a month or so ago at age 104. And another one I want to tell you about, though, is a guy named Bill Becker, and he's still alive. And he was a tail gunner on the B-24 carpetbaggers. And by the way, the tail gunners had the highest casualty rate of any crewman on the B-24. They were in a great position to fire back when there was an enemy plane coming up from the rear, but they were in a terrible position to be when the enemy plane was firing at them. And it was something like a 50% casualty rate. 1 out of 2 chances you're going to be killed or wounded being a tail gunner. But he made it through, I think, 30 missions or something, Bill did. And he was really wanting to go back last year to the D-Day celebrations, and he put his suitcase out about five months beforehand in the middle of his living room, just to remind himself that he had to stay alive that long. And he made it back, and he stepped onto French soil, and his statement was, "I made it." And there was a New York Times reporter there who wrote it down. And the next day, it was the quote of the day on the front page of the New York Times with Bill Becker's picture and his little World War II vet hat that he'd made it. Yeah.
The Carpetbagger story intersects with the story we tell at the National D-Day Memorial with one particular plane and crew. Kenneth Pratt's crew, which was shot down over Belgium on the storied date of June 6th, 1944. So this might be, testing your recollections here, but do you know anything about Pratt's crew? They're only mentioned really in a footnote in your book.
Yeah, I didn't. Again, I chose to cover the French side of the story, but I do know about Pratt's crew got shot down by anti-aircraft fire, and other Carpetbaggers crews saw the plane crash, but a number of the crew got out, including the pilot, who was able to get out. The pilot and co-pilot, and I think I think the pilot evaded. He came back over the Pyrenees and got back to England.
I think you're right.
A couple of the other crew members were POWs, and then the rest 4 or 5 were killed in the shoot down. But interestingly, on that same night, being the eve of D-Day, I have scenes in the book where the flights that are going into France are told, although nobody is saying tomorrow morning is the invasion. They weren't told that, but they said, do not fly over these beaches, Normandy, right? And they were brought in either way south, like down by Cherbourg, or way north. And they flew around that way. And it wasn't until coming back. Well, the reason was obvious. They didn't want to fly over the invasion fleet because they probably would have gotten shot down, by one of the ship gunners or something. But only when they were flying back, around 3 a.m, did they start seeing the explosions and whatnot. And of course, the airborne troops were already being dropped in and behind Normandy. But it was a surprise even to them. I mean, everyone knew the invasion was coming eventually, but when exactly they didn't know.
Yeah, Pratt's crew it came up several years ago before I knew your book was being written, because of course we have spent 25 years now trying to document who died on June 6th, 1944, and the names of I think it was 5 men who did not survive came up. They died that day, but not part of Operation Overlord. So they are recognized at the memorial, but not on the wall, but with Gold Star bricks in our Gold Star garden.
Oh, that's great to know.
Bruce, in the big picture, how would you assess the impact of the Carpetbagger missions and the resistance forces as a whole?
Well, I tell you what, I'm going to go to the no less of an expert than General Eisenhower. And what he said and wrote in his own memoirs after the war was that the French resistance was a force multiplier equal to about 5 infantry divisions, about 75,000 combatants, which is pretty huge. He also said that the resistance forces in France and the other Western countries, like in Western Europe, like Belgium, he believed had shortened the war by 6 months, their efforts. So that's pretty remarkable. I know that actually on D-Day and for several days and weeks after, there were, targets being hit, pre-assigned targets, resistance forces were hitting. That was slowing down German reinforcements from reaching Normandy. In particular, an SS armored division that was trying to race up from the south, and every time it came to a bridge that it needed to cross, it wasn't there anymore. And it was so slowed down that they ended up turning around and not even then going toward Normandy. So that was strictly resistance forces because the Allied troops weren't that far inland yet. So it was a successful operation all the way around. I want to say it wasn't just the Americans that were supplying the resistance forces. The British were too, although they didn't have as many planes dedicated to doing it as we did. But it was a combined effort, and it certainly, in Eisenhower's view, was very successful.
Yeah, I mean, these are forces operating in the field in various places in France, turning France into a very unfriendly place for the Germans to operate. And like any force in the field, they've got to be supplied logistically. And I just think it's an amazing operation. So this is done by aviation, and yet, like in the Pacific, it's done by submarine with a lot of Filipino resistance groups that are operating there. But so the Allies have gotten very good at this idea of having a kind of logistical pipeline to clandestine forces, and so it's just kind of interesting when you think about it on those different levels of like logistical support.
There was a resistance leader who at one point visited the Carpetbaggers Air Base and this was maybe a month or two before D-Day, and he was briefing the pilots on what it was like on the ground, and they had a lot of questions for him. And one of the crew asked, "Well, how many of our supplies are you actually getting?" Which is a good question, because we just drop it over a dark field and we don't know what happens there. And the guy had said, "Well, okay, some of it we can't get to. Maybe there's an enemy patrol that comes along before we can get it all. Some of it does get misdropped, sadly, but we're getting about 70% of it." And then he smiled and said, "And we put that to good use." Well, that's, when you think about it, that's a pretty good ratio.
Oh, it's a tremendous percentage. It's better than the wastage you have with a main supply route to a land unit a lot of times. So, no, I just think it's absolutely incredible, and it really comes to life in the book. And the book's called Midnight Flyboys. I encourage everyone to read it. So I have now like the hardcore historian question for you. So the book is, in part, it's an aviation story, of course, but it's also a story of special operations. Two very different kind of story structures and perhaps individuals and different source material. So how did this kind of multi-focus affect the kind of research you had to conduct to bring the story to life the way it does in Midnight Flyboys?
Well, you can't write a book like this and not love research. I mean, first and foremost, that's what I love. The writing's really the hard part. I mean, I used to, when I would write 1,000 words a day. I don't write 1,000 words a day anymore, but at some point I heard that Hemingway could write 1,000 words a day. And then whenever he finished writing 1,000 words a day, he'd go play. And it could sometimes be 10 in the morning, sometimes noon, sometimes 8 o'clock at night. And so what I used to do is put a gold star on my calendar when I got 1,000 words. And then my family and friends would expect, if they tried to reach me and I'd say, I haven't got my gold star yet. Talk to you later. They would totally understand it. But to me, I don't need that kind of payback for the research, like in the writing. Oh God, I got to do it. I got to grind it. Yeah, you do. But the research is like, wow. I mean, going down these rabbit holes and just finding out. I mean, at some point it's just, I don't know. For me, it's kind of musical. I hardly, how long my outline was to write this book? 3 pages. I had a paragraph on what I thought would be a perspective chapter. And then I just get into it, and I get enough material at my hand, and I'm a paper guy. I don't deal with digitized stuff. I want papers. I want files. I want to have them on my desk and look at them. When I'm doing a chapter about Nancy Wake, I'm doing that. I've got her spread out on my desk, her life and everything. So yeah, that's what I love. I mean, that's it.
Yeah. I mean, the deep dive into the research is really the fun part. That's when you're kind of experiencing whatever story you're telling. And then sometimes it's like detective work too, isn't it? It's you're wondering, say like Nancy Wake, for instance, you're wanting to tell her story. Okay, what was she doing here and there, and how do we figure that out? And there's always these unanswered questions, aren't there, that you have to kind of poke around. And do you find that that's how you're spending like the majority of your time in preparing a book, or do you end up having to spend more time on the writing part, which, as I agree, is 100% is the much harder part?
Well, I try to do about 6 months of research before I even start writing. What I don't like to do is start writing and have to stop and then go do more research. I mean, it's not to say that there aren't questions that always come up in the writing of it, but they should be small questions at that point, I think. And about 6 months on the writing, on the research, and then a year or more on the writing. So the writing always takes more time. And we look now. I used to do all the archival research myself, but now it's better if I stay home and stay focused on this. And I have my researchers in DC who go to the archives and know that place a lot better than I do now. And it's amazing what you can get out of there when you know what to ask for. If you don't know what to ask for, they'll get you every time.
I think the clock is fighting us again, but we'd be remiss if we didn't ask you what's next on this long list of books and great resume you have. what do we have to look forward to next?
Well, I remember I told you about that suitcase I opened up as a boy at my grandmother's. So I'm going to do the story about my uncle and his fighter group, and why it's taken me so long to do that story. I do not know, but I believe it's one I was born to write. That's what I'm doing next.
Excellent. What was the fighter group?
It was the 354th Fighter Group. They are also known as the Pioneer Mustangs because they were the first to fly the P-51 in combat. And it's quite something. I've reached out to other family members. You talk about that kind of early research and there have been I've found other families have suitcases and trunks that they still have, belonging to grandfather, uncle, or their father. And so I'm really working with a lot of families putting stuff together, and that's what I'm gonna do next.
Yeah, the aviation side has a kind of richness to it because they could keep very good records, and a lot of these guys kept diaries. And then, like you said, it was always a family with a trunk full of stuff. That's brought home, pictures. So I expect probably you're thinking in terms of like certainly your uncle's story, but other individual personal stories. Are you?
Yeah. Like one of the guys he flew with was the first Chinese American, or the only Chinese American fighter pilot in ETO, and it's from Hawaii, and what a wonderful story he was, and what he went through. And as I say, I was interviewing a 102-year-old pilot the other day who flew P-51 Mustangs, and the kind of questions I ask is, like, okay, then you go out and sit in the cockpit before you take off. How do you warm the engine up? This is where it starts. You got to ask those kind of, and to have somebody like that still as a source is great.
Yeah, those nuts and bolts details that allow you then to tell the story so that the reader feels like they're there.
Right.
And that isn't easy to do because that can only come in a way from those who were there, and sort of living vicariously through them. You know what I mean. I know exactly.
That's going to be a loss for us. How many more World War II books I'm going to be able to do and have anyone to talk to? It's a question mark.
Yeah, absolutely. So anyway, our guest has been Bruce Henderson, Midnight Flyboys, the American bomber crews and Allied secret agents who aided the French resistance in World War II. Fascinating book, all about these missions in which the B-24 bomber crewmen supplied resistance folks, and you're getting kind of both points of view, the operators on the ground and then the crewmen of a side of World War II that even though like the clandestine French resistance side is reasonably well known, this side I think not so much. So Bruce, it's been a pleasure having you today.
Thank you. Enjoyed it very much. Thanks, guys.
Thanks. John Long, please tell us about today's We Salute You.
Today on our We Salute You segment, we honor the service of Lawrence E. Sabin, a young soldier caught in the wrong place at the wrong time as Allied forces liberated France and eager reporters tried to cover the story. Lawrence Eugene Sabin was born March 7th, 1921 in Lansing, Michigan, to Byron and Ethel Sabin. Lawrence was his mother's maiden name. The couple divorced in 1925, and young Lawrence was placed in his mother's custody. She soon remarried, and Lawrence grew up with a stepfather and soon 2 half-sisters. By 1942, when he registered for the draft, he was married to the former Harriet Gump and working in Lansing for a General Motors plant. In February 1943, Harriet gave birth to twins, a boy and a girl. Sadly, the girl died of influenza only a few weeks later. The parents had little time to grieve, however. By May, Lawrence was ordered to report for duty in the U.S. Army. Private Sabin was shipped overseas and given an assignment that he must have thought safer than most in the Army, serving with the 72nd Publicity Service Battalion. This little-known unit provided support to the many civilian war correspondents covering the Allied advance through France after D-Day. Among his duties, Lawrence Sabin was assigned to be a driver for reporters and to remain at their beck and call for whatever they needed, while still trying to keep them acting within military regulations. On August 17th, 1944, Private Sabin found himself in a Jeep transporting William Stringer of Reuters and Andy Lopez of Acme News Photo as they tried to make their way to Chartres. It was clear to many reporters that the road to Paris was soon to be open, and covering the liberation of the French capital would be the biggest story since D-Day. Several correspondents thought getting to Chartres would give them a head start in the race for Paris. One problem: while the approaches to Chartres had been opened by the racing American First Army, it was impossible to be sure that every German soldier and tank had been neutralized. Sabin would be driving behind the lines, but through far from safe territory. As they crept along a quiet, seemingly deserted road, they came across a burned-out American Jeep. Slightly slowing to investigate and look for enemy gunners, Sabin was about to speed up and pass the scene. Suddenly, an anti-tank shell struck their Jeep, killing Bill Stringer instantly. Lopez and Sabin dove into a roadside ditch and then sprinted for the cover of some nearby woods, where they hid for the night with German patrols passing nearby. The next day, some French civilians found the pair and brought them food, but it seemed safer to stay hidden and hope the American forces would sweep the area. However, by dark, Sabin and Lopez decided to make their way back to friendly lines. Approaching the village of Saint-Christophe in pitch blackness, the two men suddenly heard shouts in a foreign tongue. They scattered in opposite directions. Lopez was soon surrounded by soldiers, which he realized were Allied French troops. Breathing a sigh of relief, he then went to look for his friend. Exactly what had happened was unclear, but Lopez pieced together a plausible course of action. Lawrence Sabin made it some distance away before he again was confronted by troops in the dark. He spoke neither French nor German. The soldiers shouting at him spoke no English. Sabin pulled his .45 and fired a shot. The soldiers, just as apprehensive, returned fire. Lawrence Sabin was hit and died soon afterwards, ironically killed by friendly troops in newly liberated territory. The death of the popular reporter Bill Stringer made international headlines. Not far away, a couple of days later, correspondent Tom Triner of the Los Angeles Times also was killed when his Jeep was hit by an American tank. 2 American journalists fell on what would be called the blackest days for war correspondents. But little remarked at the time was the death of young Lawrence Sabin, a mere private whose name never showed up in the bylines. Yet his quiet, behind-the-scenes service made possible the excellent journalism that kept the American home front apprised of the course of the war, and his loss was no less a tragedy. Sabin was buried in Saint-Christophe and returned after the war for burial in his home state of Michigan. Private Lawrence E. Sabin, we salute you. Thank you for your service, and thank you for doing your part to save the world.
You talk about tragedy at a multiple level. I mean, the first thing that stood out to me, he has to report for Army training just a couple weeks after his daughter dies,
yes.
And after she's born. Imagine what that might have been like emotionally. And then, this is what, August 1944, J-Lo, you said?
Yes.
Obviously that's a triumphant month for the Allies, but it also shows you how dangerous things are still in France, not just from enemy fire, but from our own friendly fire. And then third, here he is, among what would be friendly troops, but all these things go wrong, and
Exactly.
They can't communicate with one another. It's just horrifying.
It reminds you of just the chaos of war, and like you said, the last Carpetbagger crew was shot down by friendly fire in September of '44. So it happened.
Friendly fire. We've still never been able to measure it, but it's probably a solid 10 to 15% of our casualties, something like that. I'm really generalizing, but it's there.
As both of you know, I've always been fascinated by the war correspondents and how they covered the war, but also how the U.S. military, just bent over backwards in a lot of ways to make sure that the story could get home. And just having an entire 72nd Publicity Service Battalion to, make sure these guys had a Jeep so they didn't have to drive themselves. That just says a lot about the priorities that Eisenhower had for his troops.
Great point. I mean, Eisenhower was such a believer in the First Amendment and the believer that a free people had to be informed about what their troops were doing. You think about that in World War II versus what has been a very adversarial relationship at times between the reportage and the government, the military organizations. World War II is kind of a centerpiece of more positive military relations. Not that there wasn't tension, of course there always is. There's
And censorship
in there,
Yeah,
and censorship, as there had to be, But it really is kind of a shining moment in that respect. And it's a great point you make about all the resources devoted to make sure the story can be told.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, fascinating stuff. Well, our guest today was Bruce Henderson, author of Midnight Flyboys, the American Bomber Crews and Allied Secret Agents who aided the French resistance in World War II. Highly encourage everybody to read that fascinating book by just a master craftsman. So you can email our team at podcast@dday.org. Again, the address is podcast@dday.org. We love hearing from you. We really like to engage with you and make this interactive. So please do feel free to reach out. If you're enjoying our discussions on World War II and its lasting impact, subscribe to this podcast, share it with your friends, rate it, leave us a review. Again, we love to hear from you. Help us share the lessons and legacies of D-Day and World War II. Thanks for joining us, everybody. Take care.
Someone Talked is a production of the National D-Day Memorial Foundation, recorded at Media Squatch in Bedford, Virginia. The views expressed are not necessarily those of the foundation, studio, or sponsors. Promotional consideration for Someone Talked is provided by Framatome, an international leader in nuclear energy. Learn more at framatome.com. Explore the National D-Day Memorial, plan your visit, and learn more about our educational programming and upcoming events at dday.org. Join the conversation. Email our team at podcast@dday.org. So long from all of us at Someone Talked.